First, Tuesday, tomorrow, Dr. Amrita Purika will be speaking on rights, privileges, or claims, narratives of these huts in early colonial India, 1790 to 1850. And the day after, on Wednesday, Dr. Kadima Mantena will be speaking on Gandhi and the means-end question in politics. But today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Anand Yang, whose paper is titled China or Hind, an Indian subaltern travel narrative of China in 1900 to 1901. Professor Anand Yang is the Job and Gertrude Tamaki Endowed Professor of International Studies and History, Director, South Asian Center, and Co-Director, Global Asia Institute at the University of Washington, Seattle. All of us working and teaching in the field of modern Indian history have read his books and articles over the last 25 years, and these are publications which figure regularly in bibliography after bibliography. His work is among those, along with, say, people like Professor Shumit Prasad or Professor Bailey, who have widened the frame of social history in very, very scholarly, historically rich ways, even if their work has not received the same publicity as subaltern studies, which was kind of developing side by side with that. I, for example, refer to a book which has continued to remain extremely influential to date. I use it in my MA course, which is an edited book called Crime and Criminality in Colonial India. That set of articles really actually outline the field of the social history of crime and criminality, which actually set out a which set out an excellent agenda, which I think got hijacked a little bit somehow. But we find it, many of the themes were to recur again reworked, and they were reworked and emerged again in Professor Young's other publications, which were, of course, a very rich account of the densely striated power structures of one district in Bihar, that is Hind district, in his book The Limits of the Limited Raj, Agrarian Relations in Colonial India. What was remarkable about that book was that instead of taking the structures of power and dominance for granted, actually were worked out with great and satisfying complexity, and we have to understand how these power relations the cultivator had to engage with these power relations in an everyday kind of way. His next major work was titled Bizarre India, and what one reviewer said was that, unlike other works which when they dealt with agrarian society, they draw upon themes of caste and the village, here Professor Young placed rural India firmly in the network of market society, which was a really interesting exercise. Here he engaged, whereas his earlier work engaged very substantially with the field of the new social history of the 1970s and 1980s. In this book, Professor Young engaged very creatively with theoretical work on the history of faith, talking about markets at three levels: one in the administrative center of Patna, the other of religious, the markets which centered around religious fairs, and finally the humble rural heart, which was, you can say, the kind of, these were the kind of arteries through which the nationalist movement, for example, percolated into the countryside. Business field is a history which, business history is actually a field which in South Asia has been sorely neglected, with a few honorable exceptions. such as Rajas Ray and Professor Anand, most work is focused on merchant communities and neglected the spaces where merchants operate. So this is another very remarkable contribution which Professor Yang has made to the social history of South Asia. But now Professor Yang has actually shifted to the field or taken on also the field of transnational history, or to put it in a less anachronistic kind of way, one could say interregional networks which span political boundaries. Some of these networks outline, he shows the framework of empire, that the boundaries of empire were pushed not only by trade and conquest, but also by the movements of people from South Asia. His work on convict workers across Southeast Asia has brought that out in a very interesting way. And this lecture today is an extension of this work. It is drawing upon, he has managed to use travelogues both in his work on Bazaar India, and in this lecture today also he is going to extend his use of travelogues in Hindi and other Indian languages to explore the experiences of a subaltern, a military subaltern, who went along with the Indian Field Force to China in 1901 to crush the Boxer Rebellion. So without further ado, I ask Professor Anand Yang to begin.
Thank you, Professor Singha. That's a lot to do that you've done already. So thank you for that very gracious introduction. I suppose it helps that I knew her as our connections date back to her postgraduate days, and thus the kindness she's bestowed on me here. I've been living for some time, not 24 hours a day, with an Indian soldier named Gadadhar Singh, whose work I first discovered in London in the Indian Office Library. And I came across this work because I was interested in knowing what did young schoolboys learn in India in the 19th century. And so I started looking at geography books and history books written in Hindi to see what kind of information did they have about the world beyond India. And then after a while I extended that to looking at books with names of either the world or different countries in the title, and came across a series of books with China in the title. And when I picked this one up, I was very excited because here was this 319-page account written by an Indian soldier who had actually gone to China. And the more I read, the more intrigued I became by the book, and have used it, as a historian often does, such works, as a source. But now, together with Professor Kamal Sheel and his wife Ranjana Sheel at DHU, we're also doing a complete translation of this text, because as you will hear from my paper, it's such a rich account. And according to various compilations in Hindi literature, he's often identified as the first writer in Hindi of a travel narrative, of a travelogue. And I'm sure one can think of other examples, but nevertheless, I think the fact that he writes in first person about his experiences in Hindi is quite unusual. So this paper is about a man who, together with 300 of his fellow soldiers in a unit known as the 7th Rajput, embarked from Calcutta to be part of the international relief expedition whose aim was to lift the siege of the legations in Beijing. So unlike everybody else who was fleeing China, fleeing certainly North China and Beijing, Gadadhar Singh and his fellow soldiers boarded ships headed to China. And just reading his account of the shipboard voyage itself is fascinating, because here is this large group man on board, and there are several pages in there that really deal with the concerns that upperclassmen had every time they crossed the Kanapani. And he talks a lot about what they did in terms of food practices on board ships. And of course, I've come across this kind of stuff with migrants and convicts, other kinds of things that I work on. So he's a member of the 7th Rajputs, also known as the Duke of Connaught's own Bengal infantry. They were to be part of an Allied expedition. And what happened in Beijing was there was an initial attempt to lift the siege of the foreign legations in Beijing by 2,000 foreign forces, but that expedition failed. So they decided they needed a huge army to overcome the Boxers who had overrun China. And the Boxers, as some of you know, started out as a rebellion, as an uprising that was aimed against the state, but over time it became co-opted by the Qing dynasty. And so its slogan of that were really aimed against the dynasty soon became support the dynasty, and eventually the imperial troops would join the Boxer rebels. And so the siege of Beijing involved Boxers, but they also involved regular imperial troops. So this Allied expedition set out to raise the siege, and it consisted of 8 different countries. So this is the other thing that's very interesting. Here it is, the beginning of the 20th century, and this is one of the first concerted international efforts, not only involving the usual suspects, European powers, but also the United States and also Japan. And in a very different kind of way than, say, the way Africa was sliced up. So the way foreign powers divided up Africa. Here in China, they're all coming together with a single purpose, which is to raise the siege of the legations. Half the men are Japanese, and the rest are these other countries, Americans, French, Germans, Austrians, Italians, British, Russian. Most of the force of the British are Indians, overwhelmingly so, just like in all of the other campaigns. The other forces are interesting because among the Americans there are some African Americans, and the French force is largely made up of Indo-Chinese. So imagine all these forces coming together, moving forward in a somewhat synchronized manner to raise the siege, and the kinds of accommodations they have to make among themselves. And so Singh goes on this expedition and self-publishes a book in 1902 called 13 Months in China. And as he calls it, it is an eyewitness account and provides a very brief history of not only what transpired that he experienced firsthand, but it's also intended as a history of China, Japan, and the world at this point in time, particularly China and Japan. And as its cover says, it's about everything from customs and practices, to temples, to religion, etc., etc. It's designed to be a brief history of China and Japan at this time. And he says he's writing this because other soldiers might be interested, or other people might be interested. And it's important for soldiers to let the public know why it's important to be a soldier and what soldiers do, particularly if you're being victorious. So that's one of his reasons for writing this. And unfortunately, copies of this book are not widely available. I know the Shields found it in Varanasi. I found it in London. There were 1,000 copies published. And in the initial years when I used to present about this person, the standard response I would get is people saying, I think this person is fiction. No such person could exist who has written this. Since you can't find out much about him, he must not be a real person. And at that point, when I first started working on him in the 90s, I really didn't know very much about him. And he's difficult to track because many Indian names, and particularly an unusual name like his, Ganadhar Singh, it doesn't show up in the military records in England. Possibly he had some other name, although his rank, as we will see, he rose to a fairly high position. His account is so detailed that I can follow him step by step, not only through what he tells us, but also through what his commanding officer, Colonel Wang, wrote in a book called St. George and the Chinese Dragon. And there's also a history of his regiment, written much, much later in the 1940s by a fairly well-known scholar in the 20th century named H.G. Rawlinson, who seemed to have written a number of regimental histories. Part of the interest in this book is the kind of imaginary he develops. And what is so striking about this book is, unlike the other accounts written mostly by British and European and other officers, his book is suffused with ideas that anticipate the development of Pan-Asianism, a Pan-Asianism that's just beginning to emerge, but mostly among elites, among people, of course, like Tagore, among people like a noted Japanese writer who spent time with Tagore and was in India, Okakuna Tenshin, and so very much like, to use Tenshin's kind of phrase, Asia is one. You see, as Ganadhar Singh writes, and of course he's writing ex post facto, but he claims to have developed this kind of imagination as a result of his 13 months in China. An imagination that increasingly sounds very Pan-Asian. And he does actually use the word Asia and frequently talks about Asia. And as we will see, he also talks about what links India and China together. So very remarkable that a soldier like him has this kind of imagination this early on. In part, it's of course because of the kind of setting in which he's working. It's very much, to use Mary Louise Pratt's notion, it's very much a contact zone. It's very much a space where people who are geographically and historically separated come into contact with one another. Not only the different European forces, but the European forces together with the American forces, together with the Japanese. And as we will see, in this particular moment, unlike an earlier moment, 1894-95, the Europeans and Americans who have first-hand contact with the Japanese come away wowed by the military skills and abilities of the Japanese, just as Ganadhar Singh was. And one of the refrains running through his account is how amazing Japan is. And as he is being impressed by their military abilities, he will, because this is also an account that steps back and produces a history, also begins to then think about how to juxtapose Japan together with China, together with India. And as you will see, what he ends up basically reproducing is a certain kind of trajectory in which India's greatness was in the past, and it had been taken over. China was about to suffer the same kind of experience, and Japan, and what Japan had done in the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, or really the late 19th century, was a future that India, the road not taken by India, and increasingly looking at the road that China was not about to take. And so everything that Japan did rightly, India did not do. And as you'll hear me say, a lot of the rhetoric that he employs is not only the rhetoric of a warrior, but also the rhetoric of somebody who thinks the most important faith, the most important driving force in history was religion. But religion that had to be followed the right way. There was the right dharma, and then there was the wrong dharma. He also recognizes what we academics call, or what Sun Yat-sen first called China, a semi-colony. He realizes that that China's fate in 1900 was sort of like a semi-colony. It was not colonized the way India was. He also recognized what we academics call this multiple colonialism that was in effect in China, very different than India, because a number of foreign powers were operating in China to evoke the phrase that was current back then, in the process of slicing up the Chinese melon. And so this multiple colonialism, to some extent, meant that the single power could not dominate, although the way Gangadhar Singh sees it, seeing it from his British Indian perspective, he's hopeful, of course, that if China is going to succumb, it will fall under the British Empire rather than any of the other empires. You can see why this is sort of a contact zone in which there's tremendous sensitivity and awareness of the world around him, because as a military soldier, as all the troops discovered, they had to figure out ways to collaborate. And every time they didn't function in coordination, they would kill one another through friendly fire. And so how to collaborate when everyone speaks different languages, and many of the troops working for the different powers aren't necessarily from Europe, but are really colonizers, or the colonized, who are fighting on behalf of their colonial masters. A very different kind of rendition. I just came across it recently, a Japanese soldier's portraits of the different Allied troops. And of course there is this fascination because this is one of the this is the first historical moment when so many different countries are working in sync with one another. Who is this man Singh? Because he has been recognized as one of the great writers in Hindi Sahitya. We now have details about him that I didn't have. This is from one of the encyclopedias of Hindi writers. So I now know that he was born in Kanpur district, which probably explains why the Hindi in the text is not Shuddh Hindi, but it's really infused with kind of a UP dialect here and there. We know that his father was also a military man, which probably explains why he rose to the rank that he did. His father was Dariwar Singh, who was in the 5th Native Infantry and fought for the British for 14 years. We know that he completed the 10th standard, which meant that in the 19th century he gained a certain fluency of English, and as we will see, that's very important. At 17 he joined the military, and by 1898 he had become a subaltern major, and I now know that he died in 1920. Not the focus of this talk, but elsewhere in this book on Bokfors, China and the World, I've written about the importance of this hyper-masculine identity for him as a Rajput, and the extent to which he talks in his account extensively about the cult of the Rajput, the cult of the warrior, almost as if he's talking about the Bushido, the sort of code of the samurai for Rajputs. Because he says over and over again, in our jati, war is in our blood. We live to fight. That's all we care about. Nothing is greater. And he's, in a way, sort of borrows from Kipling. And instead of the 4 things that are the greatest in life, he says 2 things are the greatest in life. One is power, and the other is war. Those are the only things that matter. And the first third of his book, war is really the central focus of the first third of his book. The first third of the book is also the most autobiographical. And throughout its text, he's very conscious of the jati, the nationality, the desh that these people come from. And he distinguishes among them, but he tends to lump all the Europeans together. And he somehow separates Americans. So Americans are slightly better guys than those other, and he often uses the word Goryeo to refer to them. So he refers to them by country, but for the British, he often uses either Angrez or Goryeo to talk about them. But it's the Japanese who earn most of his plaudits, and there's section after each campaign where the Japanese soldiers are the first to go, the Japanese are the first to sacrifice their lives, the Japanese are the first to undergo extreme hardships. He comes away from every one of those experiences completely wowed by the Japanese and their valor. He also talks in very much the late 19th century lingo of an Arya Samaji. He's not quite an Arya Samaji, not publicly at least. He never says that in his text. We know that in the 1910s, he's going to produce tracts that are basically propaganda on behalf of the Arya Samaj. But it's very much about the Vedas, it's very much about, he refers to his people, he sometimes uses the word Hindustan or Bharat, but it's mostly Aryas and Aryavarta, the way he refers to people and country. And he is preoccupied with precisely the social issues that are exciting Arya Samajis across northern India. Except his lament over and over again is that unlike the Japanese, unlike the Christians, what's wrong about Aryavarta is we're divided. So whether it's people squabbling within the Arya Samaj or whether it's different groups of Hindus fighting among themselves, that they are not unified. They don't have a single vision of their religion. And whatever his thoughts about what he calls the Padre Log, or the missionaries, what they have is passion. And there's a certain kind of Shakti that moves them that he admires, even though he never really praises them. His English is good enough that he borrows, or I should say from many of his pages, plagiarizes wholesale from English texts he read. And thanks to Google Advanced Scholar, you can now track every reference down. So I pretty much identified where he lists or where he is inspired by. He doesn't really ever completely lift, because he takes sections and then he puts his spin on it. And this is what is remarkable. How much he takes from English sources. And before Google Advanced Scholar had come along, I sort of identified some of his sources just by figuring out what was the most popular book on China and Japan in 1899-1900, and went to them and found out what he had read. Now, of course, I can actually pinpoint. And there are three books in particular that he uses. The Story of China, a book by Neville Edwards, a completely Eurocentric, Anglocentric account of how barbaric the Chinese are. Sir Robert Hart, who he likes a lot better, who was the Imperial Maritime Custom official and the one European in China who always had a different take on China, much, much more sympathetic to China, and even much, much more sympathetic to the Boxers, very conscious of the kinds of wrongs that Europeans have committed that have led to the Boxer uprising and led to the anti-foreign attitudes that prevailed. And then he reads this Paul Mall journalist account, Mr. Norman's account of the peoples and politics of the Far East. And you can see where his sympathies lie from the moment he arrives in China. So there's not only what happens as he boards the ship, and he boards the ship in Calcutta, and he tells you step by step how the sun is sinking, all of a sudden it's pitch darkness, how they've left Hooghly and Calcutta behind, and how they stop over first in Singapore. And when they first stop in Singapore, they're told, hurry, we need you to get to China as quickly as possible. And so they rush to Hong Kong, and he recounts his adventures in Hong Kong, where he wants to send some letters home, but he can't make himself understood because none of the Chinese he encounters are able to understand what he's saying, because he wants to buy, and all he has is Indian currency. He wants to buy some stamps to mail some letters back home, And so finally, by chance, he encounters some Parsis standing around, and he asks them, and they help him nail his letters. And then he arrives in the entry point to get to Tianjin, to get to Beijing. So the forces are all arriving by ship, because forces were already stationed there. The initial rescue attempt has failed, so they bring in reinforcements from these 8 different countries, and they're all arriving off the coast of Beijing, off the coast of Tianjin, at a place known as the Daku Fort. And as soon as he gets here, wonderfully reproduced here in a Japanese woodblock print of this period, very different than the kind of photographs Europeans have of these forts, he looks out and the ship is about to dock, and he realizes that all he sees around him are flags aflutter, and all the flags are European flags. And the only other thing that he can see are occasional skeleton-like people, almost as skinny as the walking sticks that these skeletons are holding, namely the Chinese. And his next paragraph then says, even hearts of stone would melt at the sight of what was happening in China. And he couldn't help but feel sympathy because of what the Chinese are going through. And so right away, and of course, keep in mind that this is a retrospective account, this is not a diary. So whether or not he actually felt that, certainly once he got back and published it, that's the way he felt. And so the forts that they first had to take to occupy in order to make their way into the interior city of Tianjin involved this very bitter battle. And what he does here, as he does everywhere else, is throughout the account that he casts various kinds of aspersions about the British and what the British have done to India. But mostly he's quite subtle about his criticism. He's never really overt. But what he does is he has a method of criticizing the British through a series of interlocutors. Whether or not these were real or not, he reproduces conversations he has with a number of different people. And the first person he talks about is, when he arrives in Daku, he says, this blue jacket, which means a British Marine, came up to him and was very friendly towards him. And he said, was he friendly towards me because I spoke English? But then so many other people spoke English among the senior military officers. Why did he seek me out? And he said this person started out by saying, I too am not British, but yet I'm serving the British. I'm Irish. But I'm serving the British because we're here on a mission. And our mission is to save civilization from the jungly folk. And the Chinese are jungly folk. And so the Irish person then tells him a history of all the battles that have taken place, and tells him about the battle at Tianjin, which was very bitter and involved huge losses on both sides. He tells him about what happened at this place and how to prepare himself for fighting. Offered him all kinds of food, which of course the Irish didn't realize he could not accept because a lot of it was cooked food. And he said this Irish person was so wonderful to me, and he tried to explain to me that I too am not in English like you, but yet I'm fighting for the British because what is happening in China is a battle of the civilized world against the non-civilized people. And this, of course, was very much the rhetoric of the International Relief Expedition. It drew its legality, it drew its sustenance, its sort of ideological sustenance from being set up as the wild, superstitious, crazy boxers who believed that through their physical exercises could stop bullets. Who believed that in the beginning of the 20th century? And the civilized countries were all there to put down this rebellion and to stop this evil empire that was now in consort with these superstitious religious fanatics known as the Boxers, who killed all these missionaries and killed all these Chinese Christians. So this Irish soldier, but he said, from the very beginning, I felt a mutual sympathy towards the Chinese. So not only does he register his sentiments by his eyewitness account of these emaciated Chinese, and very few of them left intact that he saw, but also his conversation. And one of his first conversations is with this Irish sailor. He then goes on to recount other kinds of interlocutors. Generally, there are very few Chinese ones. The one time he does have a conversation with a Chinese one is with a Chinese hakim, a Chinese doctor. And he has the Chinese doctor trying to persuade him that your masters, the English, are no better, that whereas he says my role was to explain to the Chinese doctor that actually English doctors and Indian doctors, because they are Indian doctors who are part of the seven Rajputs, actually stitch up a lot of the Chinese and try to help a lot of the Chinese and also try to help Chinese orphans. But he says the Chinese hakim would not listen to me and said that actually that's not true. They patch them up, but then other troops come and massacre them. And then many of the troops actually use Chinese heads as footballs and bayonet them and chop them off and kick them around. But then he sort of said, once they get to Beijing, and they're successful in lifting the siege. And the seven Rajputs have a very important role because they're one of the first forces to get in. And I don't have the time to go into a long account of what it was like. He says when the Rajputs went in, and he says it obviously tongue-in-cheek, all these white name Psalms, he calls them Gore babies who come, and they're taking their handkerchiefs and wiping the sweat off the soldiers and offering them food and drink. And in part he's saying, of course, they would never come close to any Indian back home. But he's also saying they're doing all these things that they wouldn't do, but they're also offering things that no Indian soldier could take. So he tells a very funny story of one of the Rajput soldiers is exhausted, is injured, and this Naim-Sam comes and offers him water to drink, and there's a nice clean glass and offers him water, and of course he says, she didn't know anything about our custom. How could this person accept water from the hands of a Naim-Sam, because you didn't know the source of the water, and so it required the Rajput doctor, or the doctor who accompanied the seven Rajputs to come along and tend to the sick and the wounded. He then says once they've occupied Beijing, that this is now in March, all the soldiers get together and have this raucous holy near the Forbidden City where their quarters are. And he says they were singing and dancing and eating and merrymaking. And he said this American walked by in civilian clothes. And the American stopped to look at him and started wondering, why were these Indians acting like rowdy hooligans? And he said, I decided I'd better stop him and explain to him what was happening. And so then he sort of reproduces the conversation where he says, I told him we were celebrating one of our great festivals. And then in our festivals we sing and dance and we merry-make. And then he claims the American told him that he said, why is it that your soldiers aren't very good singers and musicians? Is it because in your country, by caste, people have to follow certain occupations? And therefore the real singers, unlike in Europe or the United States, aren't the general public who learn how to sing or who learn how to play musical instruments, but you are completely dependent on certain castes to do this kind of work. And then he uses this dependency, I'm tempted to say this dependency theory of caste, to say, you also have other kinds of dependencies. Here you are in Beijing, where you proved yourself as one of the great military forces in the world, why are you so dependent on the British? If you have shown your Marshall Medal in China, why is it that you continue to depend on other people? He then says this, and I'm mistranslating for effect here. He then says this American bored him with telling him the history of American independence. And he says, I'm not going to reproduce this for dear readers, because of course every Indian knows the history of America and knows American history, right? Which of course is not possible. But he says this Americans spent so much time talking about independence and economy. And he said, I didn't want to listen to all of this. We Indians know the history of the United States, so I'm not going to reproduce it. Anyway, it's this crazy American talking about independence. So what's the point of reproducing this American history? Clearly, what he's not telling you is basically using the American to talk about why is it that Indians are dependent on the British when they can do everything for themselves, include fight for themselves. But of course, as he explains in his extensive work, that a lot of the problems are that Jaipur fights against Jodhpur, Ranjit Singh's kingdom is put down by other Indians, that's the reason why India ultimately failed. Another photograph of the 7th Rajputs. Interestingly enough, a lot of these photographs that I found of Indian soldiers and of, including of the 7th Rajputs, comes from the University of Washington digital collection, which is online, which I didn't realize that the source was really my own university's library. And then towards the end, he begins to talk about, so is this a war about civilization? If it's a war about civilization, why is everybody looting? And in this, of course, he's no different than a number of critics, from Mark Twain in the United States to any number of journalists in Europe and the United States, that were very critical of the plunder of China that took place. And others have written about this extensively, so I won't go into this. As we know, a lot of the great treasures of China ended up in museums and art galleries and in the hands of collectors as a result of the looting that took place. And so you can see this in this kind of cartoon. You can see this in photographic evidence, hard evidence that shows that everyone was looting. On the one side you have French gathering, aggregation of all the things, and then you have pack animals carrying away huge amounts of loot that's taken. And the British officers, including the head of the colonel of the 7th Rajput, say everybody looted except the British. We didn't loot, but we won prizes during the war, which we systematically distributed. The only people who weren't involved in the huge orgy of looting, according to most eyewitness sources, are the Americans at this time. And then the British officer goes on to say, and the one people who didn't loot are Indians. But Gadagar Singh says, everyone looted. We Indians didn't loot very much. We only looted some, and we mostly looted silver. And so, thanks to the University of Washington digital collection, there were Indians melting silver that they had captured from various Chinese households and are melting all this silver to then redistribute among the troops. So he goes on with this looting to sort of end up on a note of, what about China and India? And he peppers his whole account with this, but let me sort of use this as a conclusion. He starts out this chapter by saying, who doesn't know Hindustan and China are the biggest, most fertile, and oldest of civilizations? Who doesn't know? And who doesn't know that they have lots of things in common? And throughout his account, throughout his writing of the history of China, throughout his personal experiences, he not only talks about the mutual sympathy he feels and a mutual sympathy because, and here's what's very interesting about him, which puzzles me, that he would think this way, because of course our modern way of thinking is so different. He says, we're all part of Asia. So that's one kind of commonality. Very unusual for soldiers to, at this point, thinking, Tagore, Nokakura, Tenshin, and others will, of course, take this up in the first decades of the 20th century, but it sort of operates more in the rarefied world of intellectuals. The second he says is, we have in common, and this, of course, our prime ministers and our presidents often use this whenever there are visits back and forth, we have Buddhism in common. He said, I didn't realize this, that when I first got there, that China wasn't a Buddhist country. That it was a Buddhist country in the past, and Buddhism is still alive, but it's really a Confucian country. But nevertheless, we have Buddhism in common, and that unifies China and India. Third, and again here I think it's sort of the crucible of the contact zone that he's operating in, he says, racially, we're the same. We're all colored people, and we're all, he even uses this phrase, if they're the Gorelog, we're black people. We're all black people. And so it's very interesting that he doesn't, he uses the color yellow periodically, but mostly he uses black to describe everybody. Japanese are black, Chinese are black, Indians are black. So it's a racial, ethnic, cultural, geographical commonality that brings these people together. But what stands in the way of China, and by extension India, is that they're arrogant. That our country lost its independence because we were arrogant. And the one kind of knowledge we lacked is military knowledge. Our officials are corrupt. India was corrupt. Aryavarta was corrupt. Therefore it succumbed to the British. People fought against one another on behalf of the external power. Populations are too large. There's wasteful spending. You can see how the Arya Samaj agenda is sort of being reproduced here. There's female illiteracy, and later on he's going to write a whole tract about the importance of female literacy and the importance of advancing the cause of women. China has a dependence on opium. Interesting that he doesn't make more of a case of that opium coming from India to make addicts out of China. But he says we have our own dependence. Our dependency is that we're dependent on foreign goods. And he has an English person come up to him, and he reproduces this conversation, where the English person says, you guys are several centuries behind us, and you're behind us because your economic system and trading system works to your disadvantage. And then Gazanda Singh then goes on to basically write, again, interesting that and of course the timing is right, although he doesn't cite any other writers that he got this from. He says there's a drain of wealth. And the drain of wealth is in our trading system, where cloth, which was textiles, which was the source of India's wealth, is gone. And tea, which was the source of China's wealth, is gone. And so he ends up saying, what's the hope? Is China going to become India? And he ends, not in the book, because it's buried in the middle of the book, he says, maybe the one thing that is different, one thing that could be hopeful is that if China fell to the hands of the foreign powers, that it would become part of the British Empire. And were it to become part of the British Empire, China and India, so not Asia as one, China and India would become one. And this Hind or Chin Hind would become the largest country in the world, unified by race, by religion, by culture, and by a single empire that basically anticipates the notion of Chindia. that even though it would be under British Empire, it would be a different kind of configuration, because neither China nor India were willing to go through the kinds of reforms Japan had gone through. So in his schema, China is sort of India's past, Japan is the future that could have been, but never was in the case of India. And it didn't look like China was going to go that way either. But were it to go under, it would have a different kind of future. So what's remarkable about this account, and let me end on this note, is the way his critique of empire, of colonialism, is buried in this account, but also very much manifested through these interlocutors that basically are his voice, because his voice is quite apparent, and that somebody like him could write this account as overtly as he did. And of course it was written because although this book ended up in London, I'm sure no censor really read it or could have read it, and if the person tried to read it, they couldn't have understood it. So he was safe in that regard. But the fact that this person at the beginning of the 20th century has this kind of trans-Asian imagination makes this account an extremely rich account, which also is remarkable because he seems to know so much. It's not only what he sees through his eyes and his experiences, but also what he's acquired through reading. And so the Shields and I are hoping that in the next few months our translation will be complete, although I'm really working on a completely different topic.